The honourable member from Calgary-Shaw. You have 20 seconds.
Thanks, guys.
Excuse me, honourable member, are you speaking on 29.2A or speaking on the bill?
I'm sorry, madam. I was planning to speak on the bill.
Go ahead. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Speaker. It is a pleasure to stand here and comment on the Protection and Compliance Statutes Amendment Act. Obviously, as we've heard today, there's 3 bills that are being impacted by this, and I do think that it's an important piece of legislation. I think that there are improvements that can be made, and I just want to talk through a few of them. Now, starting with the Fair Trading Act, and I guess the overall principle of protecting Albertans from business operators that willfully take advantage of workers or customers. And the reality is there are people out there who possess such little integrity and strength of character that they're only out for themselves, that we need to have legislation that will allow and provide for the director the ability to levy these administrative penalties to penalize companies who don't follow the rules. I have a couple of examples that I'd like to share, one of which has impacted members in my very constituency of Calgary-Shaw. There's a gentleman who had, I don't know if gentleman is the correct word for it, but there's an individual who's been charged, and he was running a contracting business. Now this contractor would go to various individuals and do up estimates and quotes to do work in their homes, renovate their kitchens, and he'd take deposits. He would never get the work done. He'd hire other contractors who would then go in and start some of the work, but then he wouldn't actually pay those contractors. And then the contractor that he had hired would then leave the job half done, leaving these families with absolutely no recourse. Now, this individual continued doing this over and over and over again until he was eventually in the hole or owing some of his creditors in the range of $1.5 million. And what makes matters worse is not only was there no recourse for the consumers in the first place to get that money back, nor was there recourse for the contractors that he had hired to go and start working for him, but he actually was able to start up another company under another name and do the whole thing over again. So it's absolutely shameful. And I'm hopeful that what we see in this act will start to prevent some of these people from willfully taking advantage of others. And I hope that even though, if someone is in this situation where they're clearly bankrupt or they have no way of paying back the creditors that they owe, I'm unsure how a fine is really going to impact what they're going to do, but I'm hopeful that at least it would stop them from going and starting up another company and doing the rinse-repeat to other people. Now, there's another example that I'd like to share as well, and this is a story of an individual that I personally, through the last company I worked at before being elected, I had done business with, and our company did business with him. He willfully contracted our company to provide services for a very large and well-known event that took place in the city of Calgary. It was incredibly high profile. There were dozens of vendors that this individual and his corporation, I guess, strung along, that they would be getting paid after the event. And unfortunately, for many of us, we didn't. Now, the hard reality is that there are laws that protect people like this. And what this individual did is the day after the event, he filed for insolvency. And that gave him, I guess, a green light to not pay any of those bills. There was no recourse. Lawsuits were filed. Well, actually, it's interesting that you should ask. He was the former chief of staff to the premier.
That guy, right, yeah.
Yeah, so this is an individual who, after filing insolvency, and again, this is a very personal story. It was a fact. I was the individual responsible for negotiating with him around our services. And yes, absolutely, he ripped off IATSE. Yeah, there's no question he did. Yes. There's lawsuits that are still filed. I think ours was in the range of $70,000. So the reality is, files insolvency, does not pay the bills. The next day, he starts a company under a new name, operating out of the same building, that he was in downtown Calgary. Moves his office furniture, sells some of it, doesn't advise the creditors that he's selling off assets, even though he's claimed insolvency, and he's making money. And then, obviously, this individual has gained some notoriety for some political success that he's had since then. Again, incredibly unfortunate that there is no recourse for a number of these creditors. And let's keep in mind that not only are we talking about NIATSE, a large union, and I think it was about $30,000 that they were stiffed.
And the union covered it.
Sure, exactly. We're talking about small businesses as well. We're talking about small businesses, my apologies, Madam Speaker, where a $10,000 hit is enough for them to not be able to pay the bills that month, to not be able to make the rent. And the reality is that without the recourse to stop individuals like this from continuing behavior that is clearly devoid of character when there's intent, and there's willful intent, because there's no possible way that that individual thought he would be able to pay those bills the week before the event was going to happen, but he allowed it to happen. And had that individual suggested to some of those vendors, listen, this might not go as planned, are you able to cut us a break? Can we let's start negotiating now, because we're in trouble. I'm sure a lot of those vendors would have stepped up out of the respect for the fact that it was the Dalai Lama coming to Calgary to address a crowd. I'm sure that for the people of Calgary, those vendors would have said, you know what, for the benefit of all citizens here, let's not prevent them from being able to enjoy this. But that never happened. Insolvency was filed, lawsuits were filed, lawsuits were never paid, individual was hired by the Premier, and now is on Power and Politics on CBC, he's on CTV, he's writing a book, and hopefully in that book we have a little chapter on how to get away with things.
About integrity.
Yeah, I doubt you'll find a chapter on integrity in that book. No. The reality is, the Fair Trading Act hopefully will now have the teeth to prevent these sorts of actions moving forward. And so in that sense, fully supportive of this part of the bill. The occupational health and safety side of this act, I think there's a lot of positives here as well. The Auditor General has clearly asked this government to take some action with regards to ensuring that workplace safety is a paramount concern moving forward. And I think that some of these administrative penalties are going to help achieve that. It was first asked for in, I believe it was the July 2010 Auditor General report, again mentioned in July 2012. But we have some movement, we have some action. So, small steps are sometimes good steps. And, we do have some concerns, obviously, about overzealous OH&S officers, or, how these fines are going to be impacted just by the will of an officer as opposed to actually having a set guideline as to how they can levy these fines. Because there is a pretty high maximum. We're encouraged to see that there's a provision for smaller fines to be handed out to the individual worker if they're not following code. Because there is an amount of responsibility. It's incumbent upon the worker to follow the safety code, just as it is the employers who are there trying to protect these guys and girls and women and men who are out there every single day. And if you're not wearing steel-toe boots on a construction site, it's not always the employer who needs to be the one who catches the fine for that. So losing a day's wage I believe it's an incentive or a disincentive to change behavior, and in this case, I think that it's probably a positive thing. The private sector and the oil and gas sector has led the way in workplace safety in our province. They preach safety. It is their number one concern, because they recognize that the people that work for them are their most important asset, and without them, they're nothing. And I think that it's good to see that our government across the floor here is starting to recognize that as well, and they're starting to follow some of these recommendations from our Auditor General. With regards to the creative settlements, I applaud the leader of the official opposition for her idea on having a fund set aside. So when some of these large fines are levied by OH&S, these creative settlements, which will now, based on this act, the government will be able to impose, they will be able to force payment of these, whereas perhaps before there was an issue with that. I'd really like to see that money go to a good cause, to go to further educating some of our workplaces, to go to further educating on the best practices of safety standards. And I think that an amendment that our honourable leader will be bringing forward hopefully will go to address some of these things. It's the reality is our economy and everything that we have here in Alberta is dependent on workers being able to go to work, feel safe, feel secure, go home at night, get up and do it again. We've had other conversations about this earlier this week as well. With regards to the third section, which takes into account the Safety Codes Act, there are some, again, increased fines. I think that anyone who is privy to the story of that tragedy that happened in Calgary with the 3-year-old girl who was killed by a windstorm and improperly secured metal, it breaks the heart of anyone who hears it, and it infuriates the blood of anyone who also heard that the maximum fine that was allowed at the time was $15,000 for the life of a 3-year-old child because they didn't follow code. It's awful. And so it's very encouraging to see that now with new increased maximums in this area that we're going to be able to actually put some teeth into that so that when something as serious and as tragic and devastating as the death of an infant child happens on downtown Calgary streets in the province of Alberta, the people responsible are going to pay, and they're going to pay dearly. I would suggest that perhaps some clarification by the ministry would be appreciated with regard specifically to Section 40-3. In regards to, are we sure that the daily fine of $10,000 can only be applied once a person has received a notice of a violation? So in other words, the 2-year limit for a fine in 40-3.5 wouldn't mean that a company would have to pay a daily fine going back 2 years. Again, just seeking clarity, and also with regards to specific regulations concerning these multi-day fines in cases where there is no imminent danger and a company can't get the needed subcontractor back in to fix something right away, what kind of recourse would there be? The only other question that I would raise is around the prime contractors, Madam Speaker. And I just consider it from a residential building construction perspective. If, for example, a builder in a development is building 24 homes at a time, are they now expected to have a safety officer as the prime contractor in every single one of those building sites, which is clearly unreasonable? Sure. I appreciate your feedback, the honourable member from Edmonton Centre. I guess what I'm wondering is, are we passing legislation that is unrealistic to be followed? And if we are, in the sense of something like residential construction, are we setting ourselves up for some sort of failure? I fully understand why we would do this on large construction sites, but again, if we're in a development where there's 24 homes being built by a single builder, is it okay for them as the prime contractor for all of those builds to have one safety individual in that community? Or are they, again, expected to now have a single prime contractor represented in every single one of those homes? And let's be realistic. If they are, those costs will just simply be passed down to the home buyer. And I think that, again, we need to be realistic with whether or not that would be followed. And the feedback we've received from stakeholders in the industry is that that just simply would not be. Other than that, I look forward to continuing to debate this legislation. I look forward to seeing some teeth, and I do applaud the work that has been done by these 3 ministries to come together on this bill and actually get something done. So thank you, Madam Speaker.